I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. We don't always talk about journalism here on this podcast because it can sometimes feel a little bit navel-gazy, but it's a core feature of civic life and the policy space. So when journalism is in the crosshairs, it's good to take a look at why and how organizations are responding. The WBUR Festival is coming next week to Boston, so that's Thursday, May 29th to Saturday, May 31st, against a backdrop of attacks on public media coming from the White House, of all places. So today I'm joined by Margaret Low, CEO of WBUR in Boston, to talk about the storm around NPR and other public outlets. Margaret, thanks for being here.
It's a delight, Jennifer. Nice to be here.
So Massachusetts is lucky, in my humble opinion, to have so many news outlets, including 2 major NPR stations anchored in Boston, plus, of course, all of the stations across the state. But public media can be conceptually a little confusing for people trying to piece together how threats to federal funding will impact the stations that they listen to. So why don't we do a little Public Media 101 here? How are stations like WBUR funded?
It is a complicated world, so let me try to break it down for you. We are funded by a combination of things. We're funded by our members. Our greatest support comes from both members and philanthropy. We also raise sponsorship dollars, people who support us, and you hear their messages on our air and you see them online. We also raise dollars through syndication. We are the biggest producer of national programming of any public radio station in the country. So we produce 2 shows, Here and Now and On Point, and those make a living. In addition to that, we've launched a number of small businesses that are making a good go of it for us. So small example, we have City Space, which is a gorgeous state-of-the-art events venue right downstairs beneath where I'm talking to you now on Commonwealth Avenue. And people from across the city and state rent it because it's a wonderful place. And in fact, I'm proud to say that this weekend we're having our first bat mitzvah in City Space. So that's a burgeoning business. And we also have something called City Space Productions, which is effectively a custom podcast studio. So we realize that one of the things we do really, really well is we make podcasts, and that, as you know, everybody in the whole wide world wants to make a podcast. And so we're helping other businesses make podcasts. So that's a burgeoning business too. And our theory of the case is we have supported our work in very straightforward ways for years and years and years. And in this new world order, we have to be making other bets on how to make a living.
And so the elephant in the room, a big part of the reason we're talking about these funding structures is because President Donald Trump's posture toward many mainstream outlets, including public media, has been fairly hostile. Earlier this month, he directed the Corporation for Public Broadcasting's board of directors to, quote, cease federal funding for NPR and PBS, claiming ideological bias. So when you saw that initially, what was your first response?
So let me go back, if you don't mind, Jennifer, because I realized that in all of the things I told you about, I neglected to say that we do get federal funding. So WBUR, like member stations across the country, get what are called community service grants from the CPB to support our journalism. And in the last year, we got about $1.6 million from the CPB, and that's about 3% of our budget. Look, we know that independent journalism is in the crosshairs, and we know that NPR, PBS, and member stations are a prime target. Our job is to make sure that the people who may ultimately vote on whether federal funding is continued understand the power and the purpose and the mission of public media. And what I know is that many of us were on Capitol Hill last week talking to our delegations and making the case for NPR and member stations. And obviously, the Massachusetts delegation is in our corner, and most remarkably, Senator Markey, who really is, as his staff said, gearing up for the fight and really, really wants to make sure that we stay supported, because he understands that while he understands how important public radio is to cities and states across the country, in red states and blue, not just Massachusetts.
And so this is a live issue. The CPB is already suing over orders directing it to fire several board members. It said the executive order in question here is lawless specifically because the nonprofit entity is authorized and funded by Congress. So both BUR and I'm sure in conversation with other public media heads, What is the posture here, Margaret? Do you have to prep as though these cuts will happen or anything else?
It's a very good question, and it's the right question. And the answer is we have to be aware and we have to brace for what's possible, but we also have to keep doing what we do. And we know why we're here, and we know the purpose we serve, and we know that at least for WBUR, there are millions and millions of people who can't imagine a day without WBUR in their life and the journalism and the programs that we produce. So we are proceeding next year with a disciplined, careful budget. And while we know there could be millions of dollars lost if federal funding goes away, we don't have a plan in our back pocket that we're ready to pull out at any time. We want to watch, wait, see what happens. And we also know that people are calling and writing to their members of Congress, to their delegations in the House and in the Senate, and making the case. And that's the most important thing that can happen, is for people to literally pick up the phone and call their district offices and say, this is important, not just to me, but it is important to the fabric of our community and ultimately to making the world a better place, a healthier democracy, because it's really important for people to be informed so that they know how to think about the big issues that we're confronting. And we really are a public service, and we're free and accessible to everybody, whether they can afford a subscription or not. And that's a really defining characteristic.
And even before the president's recent statements, public media has faced chronic underfunding, existential questions. Institutions across the country, including here in Boston and Massachusetts, have been handing down layoffs, buyouts. We're dealing with revenue shrinking, listener decline. What is different about this moment right now? How do you contextualize the posture of the White House in that broader existential muddle?
I've devoted my life to this cause. I started as an overnight production assistant on Morning Edition and eventually ran the news division at NPR before going to the Atlantic and then to WBUR. And I could say young producer. I was a youngish producer on All Things Considered when Newt Gingrich, this is 30 years ago, when Newt Gingrich, then Speaker of the House, tried to defund public media. And there was an outpouring of support from across the country, people writing and calling and making sure that it was not defunded. And we prevailed. And it was, as I've said, we breathed a sigh of relief then. It feels very different now. The many compounding issues are more challenging. I mean, this is the most challenging moment for journalism that I've ever seen. And it's not just, we're not alone in this. I mean, independent journalism is, as you know, given what you do, is so important to the fabric of this country, and especially local journalism, which really helps people understand what's going on in their communities. It's threatened by so many things. I mean, it's threatened by the loss of advertising. We know that so many of the sponsorship dollars that used to fund news organizations now go to the tech platforms that have no stake in local communities. And then that's compounded by the shifts in technology and changing audience patterns. And then it's compounded by the politics of the moment. I often said, we are a business for good. We're not necessarily a good business. And that's why, we are entrepreneurial and business minded and believe that we have an obligation to spend the public's money wisely. But it is why philanthropic support is so crucial to what we do.
Well, that's a great lead in as well, because I'd like to talk for a moment about the place of public media and BUR in national and local discourse here. So PBS and NPR, especially recently, but it's been for some time now, been framed by Republicans as partisan institutions, actually. And the organizations have done some soul searching about their audience and ideological bent, if any. I'm curious, do news institutions have a set of core values that they sort of have to defend when they're challenged that will almost inevitably draw them into partisan conflict? How do you deal with the business ramifications of those dynamics?
So, and I don't want to keep harkening back to the fact that I've been at this for a long time, but the values actually haven't changed. The values remain the same, right? It is not our job to take a side or to advocate or to support up policy. It's actually our job to report as rigorously and fairly as we possibly can. We are not the resistance. Our only commitment is to the truth and to capturing stories that really reflect how people are experiencing what's going on in their life and the ramifications of the news that's unfolding, whether it's in Washington or in Ukraine or in Boston. And to really give people insight and understanding and not do it breathlessly and fast, but to do it deeply and contextually. So many of the decisions we make are about, why does this matter today? What are people going to learn? What are they going to feel? What are they going to remember? And if you stay true to those values and commit to the fact that it's not our job to take a side, it's our job to do quite the opposite, which is to give people understanding, give them a window, help them make sense of what's going on in the world and in their community.
Is there any concern about the way that public media has sort of been boxed into by sort of outside folks, been boxed into this idea of it being an ideological box, though? I think that's what I'm poking at a little bit, which is that it doesn't always matter how it's defined internally if it's being reframed externally.
No, of course, you're right. And yes, there's a concern about that, right? We don't want to be boxed into something that we're not. We want to be boxed into something that we are.
I'm curious now about how the posture looks heading into this coming weekend. So that's when listeners are hearing this. We are heading toward the WBUR Festival. Does it feel to folks like a full-blown existential crisis? Is this a strategizing thing? Is it a kumbaya moment? What is this?
It's interesting. I mean, of course, there are existential threats, and yet we know why we are here. We know that we actually make Boston and the region a better place. And the festival is really both a celebration of the fact that we're 75 years old, that we've been around in a public service in this city, in this region for that long. And it's also, as I've said, it's a love letter to the city and region and people who have fueled us for 75 years. And one can cower and just put your head down and just say, we're going to be pummeled and let ourselves be pummeled, or you can, sing from the mountaintops and do what you do best. And the festival is I believe, a sort of beautiful expression of what WBUR is and what it means to the city and region and to the country.
And I did get a little bit of I don't want to say a chuckle, maybe like a dark chuckle when I was looking through some of the featured speakers, which make a lot of sense, but, probably won't be dodging the ideology allegations with Anthony Fauci, Kimberly Crenshaw, and recently Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg, who made news himself because he was accidentally added to a Signal chat where top administration officials were discussing imminent plans for military attacks. So when you've all been thinking about kind of who would be the best to hear from, who can kind of speak to the moment of journalism and politics and meaningful civic participation, how were you crafting that roster? There are many other guests, to be clear.
Right. No, there are many, many other guests. And as I've often said, it's going to be serious stuff, and it will be. And it's also going to be wicked fun. I mean, we're kicking off with Wait, Don't Tell Me on Thursday night, a week from the day that you and I are talking, Jennifer, and so much more in between. And, Jeffrey's a newsmaker, right? And I also had the pleasure of working with Jeffrey for 5 years when I was at the Atlantic, and the Atlantic is a partner, as is the New York Times, as is NPR. So he was an obvious addition. And of course, he is both a brilliant journalist and hilarious. And when I texted him and I said, okay, so what should we title your session? And he wrote back in I think he texted back before my text landed in his inbox, and he just said, signal and noise, right? And it just came straight from his brilliant, I said, we need a cool Atlantic style festival. Anyway, so look, we're bringing people who we believe our audience wants to hear from, learn from, and experience. And we know that some of the people who are speaking may be controversial to some. They're also newsmakers and making a mark in the city and the country and the world.
I wonder, this is kind of related to the panel as well, how you're thinking about the concept of credibility these days. And if you'll humor me, I'll explain kind of why this was in mind. I was looking through the speakers for the festival, and Michael Barbaro, who of course hosts the extremely popular New York Times podcast, The Daily, caught my eye because in 2021, as I'm sure you recall, there was a dust-up over the 2018 podcast Caliphate, not just involving underlying reporting on the Islamic State, but also personal disclosures / conflicts and the way that the Times and the Daily responded. But the reason that I bring this up is the Public Radio Program Directors Association, which I think has been renamed since, but they represent executives at public media outlets. They run the Daily and all of their local stations, and so they objected to the way that the Times handled it, but they noted that the feedback about editorial standards was coming from inside the industry more than listeners. Listeners don't know if they're hearing something that might be complicated or have conflict involved. And so it's often news organizations and the news ecosystem that sets out and enforces its own sort of ethical standards. So I wonder how you're thinking about the interconnectedness of these public media stations. If something goes wrong and it gets kind of pushed out across, that can have a pretty far-reaching impact. But then the flip side of it is very good, strong journalism, of course, also gets pushed off across these systems. So I know that's a big windup, but I'm very curious about how you're thinking about your role as part of this network that often has to kind of push back against credibility inquiries.
I mean, I'll just talk about Michael, who I think is one of the most talented journalists I've ever encountered in my life. And news organizations hit bumps, and the important thing to do is run towards them, understand what went wrong, and to correct them. And I think the New York Times has done that impressively. And while there was pushback in the public radio system against the Daily, I never thought for a minute about taking the Daily off the air on WBUR. I'm a champion and I'm a believer. And one of the most important things we can do, because we hold others accountable, is to hold ourselves accountable. And I'm not talking singularly about that experience. I'm talking about everything. And we have to constantly be saying, what do we do well? What can we get better? And what can we get better the next time? And we have to raise the bar for others, and we have to raise the bar for ourselves.
And how are you thinking about the local news component to public radio? In many places, we've seen daily newspapers, weekly newspapers completely hollowed out. There are kind of ghost paper regions, but many of them do still have access to a radio, to a station, might be NPR, might be something else. So how do you think about your role in the local news ecosystem as it's been changing and condensing?
So our localness, sort of our Boston and Massachusettsness, is core to who we are. It is our mission to play a meaningful role in the community that we serve. And I think of WBUR, and I hope the people who count on us think of us in the same way they might think about the symphony or the hospitals or the art museums or the science museums, and think of us as part of the fabric of this brilliant, beautiful town, worthy of the kind of support that we need for an institution like BUR to not just survive, but to thrive. And I'm happy to report that people are really responding to the moment and really reaching out with another level of support. And the people who support us do so not just because we carry national news. It's a very important component of who we are, but we also are really a local organization with roots. All of our local journalists live in the community that they report on. So like our audiences, they care about the health and well-being of the city and the region and the state. Local news is really what ultimately helps, I believe, our audience feel like they're deeply connected to us. You know, I spent my life in national news. I was at NPR, I ran the news division, I was at The Atlantic for 5 years, storied editorial organizations. There is something very powerful and very beautiful about being in a local news organization that people feel a deep relationship with, and they do, and I'm buoyed every day by that.
And I'm trying to figure out the best way to ask this, but to what extent are these sort of different positionings marketable? The kind of strength of NPR as a local organization facilitating structure, essentially. So we've got all of these local NPR stations. They do wonderful work. I'm recording this from Utah right now. We like our local station here in Park City as well. But there is the question that's kind of come to mind as we've been talking about what does get people to contribute? What does get people to listen? What does get kind of money coming in through the door? Because we have seen ebbs and flows, dwindling listenership, and that also is impacted by economic changes. If people have less money in their pocket, it makes it harder for them to contribute to their local stations. But one thing that we've seen throughout the first Trump administration and the current one that I would love your take on is this idea that it is sometimes difficult, without branding yourself as the resistance, to then explain why you might be in a sort of oppositional stance to a government's policy as it impacts the organization, which might be a way to get people to donate, kind of as a response to that. So how are you thinking about those? That's a mess.
Well, it's a layered and good question. And I would say, and I actually said this in a all hands meeting with my team, with the BUR staff yesterday, we can be for the truth. We can be for the health and well-being of independent journalism. We can be for the continuation of federal funding. We can be for asking people to support our journalism. Those aren't political stands. Those are value-based stands. And what's striking is that I think people are looking for places to place their bets right now for things that they believe in. And while we're not the only organization or set of organizations in the crosshairs, if they contribute, I think people feel like they're not just doing something that is for their own well-being. I mean, people do tell us, I cannot imagine a day without WBUR. You are essential in my life. You are my lifeline. We hear that kind of thing all the time. But they're also contributing so that other people have access who might not have the ability to pay. And that's a really defining principle. And the other defining principle of who we are and what we stand for. And I think the singular differentiator about NPR and member stations across the country is that we are this local national partnership. I mean, it is an extraordinary enterprise that has stood the test of time over 50 years with thousands and thousands of reporters in red states and blue telling the stories of their community and also reflecting what's happening across the country and the world. Nobody else can claim that but NPR and member stations.
Thanks again to Margaret Low for joining me on the podcast. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producers are John Gee and Charlie Cazella. Leave us a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, or if there's anything about public media near you that I should know about. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.